Beginning with the historical note, then, to the chief musician on Neginoth, Maskil, a psalm of David. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not thyself from my supplication. Attend unto me and hear me. I mourn in my complaint and make a noise. Because the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked, for they cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me. My heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. And I said, Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. Lo, then would I wander off and remain in the wilderness. Selah. I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go about upon the walls thereof. Mischief also and sorrow are in the midst of it. Wickedness is in the midst thereof. Deceit and guile depart not from her streets. For it was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me, that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked into the house of God in company. Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon will I pray, and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me. God shall hear and afflict them, even he that abideth of old, Selah, because they have no changes, therefore they fear not God. He hath put forth his hand against such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn like swords. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. But thou, O God, shalt bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in thee. Okay. And that means that the reading is over. So this is one of the Maskil Psalms. That means a hymn of instruction. And we see the instruction usually towards the end of the psalm, and we'll see that when we get there. And this Psalm of David was written when he was fleeing from his own son, who was being counseled by David's formerly closest advisor and former friend. His name was Ahithophel. And Ahithophel's betrayal was especially egregious to David, and we can see this in the psalm. The pain that David was feeling is evident in his writing, but it's David's faith in his God that characterizes the prayer more than his pain. Some have thought to see this as a messianic psalm, and they liken the betrayal by Ahithophel of David to the betrayal by Judas of Jesus. But to me, it seems the likenesses fall apart after this, and in a kind of a drastic way. So I think that we need not read very far in the psalm to see this is kind of a tortured effort, and without credibility or profit. I do believe we should look for Christ in the Old Testament, but let us not ascribe to Christ that which was not meant to reflect him, right? Turns out some of them were just about David. And so, anyway, you'll see as we go along. I'm not going to address it directly, but it seems obvious to me that the likeness falls apart. So anyway, I've divided this into 4 sections, and we'll start with the first one in verses 1 through 8, in which David expresses his feelings and his suffering. And that's pretty much how he starts all of these psalms, in which he comes to God with a complaint, right? When he comes in a place of need. Psalms that aren't born directly out of a high point in David's life often begin with a description of suffering and sorrow and pain. And so let's just take these a verse or two at a time. And the first thing we see under David expressing his feelings and his sufferings is we see that he desires God to hear him. This also is pretty characteristic of how David begins a psalm of this sort. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not thyself from my supplication. Attend unto me and hear me. I mourn in my complaint and make a noise. So David expresses here what seems to be his feeling of being alone and not heard. It's not explicit, right? He doesn't say explicitly that he's not being heard. But what do you hear from someone that tells you, hey, listen to me? People don't usually start a conversation that way, right? Usually it's about halfway through the conversation when they stop and say, hey, listen to me. This is what I've heard. Happens to other people. But well, I wasn't looking. Okay. So anyway, I'm not to try to apply my own personal experience here or anything. I'm just saying, when you start a prayer to God with "Don't hide from me" and hear me, perhaps David at least is feeling like he hasn't been heard. But he stops short of making the accusation, and that's also typical of David with the respect and the honor that he gives to the Lord. He's never short of expressing his feelings, how he's feeling, right? But he knows better than to accuse God of something. And as a matter of fact, usually by halfway through the psalm, as we see here as well, he declares, God has heard me, right? That's because as he continues his prayer and the closeness of fellowship with God increases, he's more and more confident that he's being heard by God. And that is how it works, right? When you're in a place where you feel like, the sky is brass and God's not listening, and just start talking and start praying to him, and he'll let you know that he's listening, that he's heard. And so in the end of verse 2, he reveals the measure of suffering that he's enduring. Did you notice that? He says, I mourn in my complaint and make a noise. Now, it's a very literal translation from the Hebrew to English here, and you can kind of guess what it's implying. He's acknowledging that his sorrow has reached a point that in expressing it, he can't do it silently. That there's a noise, right? and given the context and what he's going through and how he's expressing his feeling and his suffering, it's a groan or a sob that he's talking about. And maybe you can identify with that. Talking to God and the emotion rising up within you to the point that it comes out in a sob. And you don't have to talk aloud when you pray to God, that he hears your thoughts without you saying, without you vocalizing. But on occasion, the emotion gets to the point where a sob comes out nevertheless. And it seems like this is the level of suffering that David is going through. We get to verse 3 and we see that he's convinced that people hate him. And to be clear, from what we understand of David's life, yeah, that was true, right? He says, because of the voice of the enemy, and that's what had caused him to sob, right? Because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked, for they cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me. So David's addressing here accusations that had been made by Absalom against him at the advice of Ahithophel. Ahithophel being formerly David's close counselor and friend, who is now advising his son, who has risen up in insurrection against him. And he says, "For they cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me." And this is what has given David so much angst. And in his accusation of David, Absalom was oppressing the people and oppressing his own father as well. So he says, because of the oppression of the wicked. He speaks of the oppression of his son towards him and towards all those that he was upon whom he was foisting this insurrection. When you go back and you read the backstory of this insurrection, you see that there was a time when Absalom started to prepare the people to be loyal to him instead of his father. He'd come into the gates, and he'd stop and he'd talk to someone, and he'd say, they would bow to him because he's the king's son, right? And he would get off his horse and go hug the person, right? And beware of huggers, man. I tell you what. No, I'm just kidding. That's totally okay. Anyway, so he'd get off his horse and he'd go hug the person, and then he'd say, "Man, I tell you what, I wish you had some governmental help and representation here where you are. If I was king, I'll tell you what, I would make sure you're taken care of." It's just paving the way, right? And they don't do that kind of thing anymore. They're all up above board. But that's how Absalom prepared the hearts of the people to be oppressed by him. Anyway, so where was I here? I wandered off. So that was verse 3. The hate levied against David by his son was painful. And you see in verse 4, he's emotionally pained by their hatred. Okay, he says, "My heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me." David feels the pain of his son's attacks in his heart, but he's truly endangered in body as well, because Absalom is literally trying to kill him. And I mean, that's a dual-prong burden for David to carry. Make no mistake, as a father, being hated by your kid would be worse than being killed, having your life threatened, right? And so he's carrying both of these things, and his heart is sore pained within him, and the terrors of death are fallen upon him. Verse 5, he says, we see that he's afraid. He said, "Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me." These dual burdens that David carries. The emotional pain of being hated by those he loved so much, and in fear for his own life. It's horrifying and it's overwhelming, and that's how he describes it. In his worst instincts, David just wants to run. He wants to get away. And not just get away so that he's safe. He can't see where he is being survivable just from a human standpoint. And it says, I wish I could run. You see it in verses 6 through 8. He wants to run from his troubles. And I said, he testifies of his feelings and his thoughts, "Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest." I see three things here that are tempting David to run. And one is that this false promise of fleeing from his troubles was rest. I can only imagine how exhausting it would be to have these dual burdens upon him. One, wondering if you're going to be killed in your sleep, right? I imagine that's not real conducive to sleep. But I'm absolutely sure that being hated by your son also is not conducive to sleep, right? And so false promise of fleeing from his troubles, that false promise is a promise of rest. And so it might seem like just getting as far from the situation as possible, that then I'll have rest. That's a false promise. Lo, then would I wander off. I would wander far off, if he had wings like a dove, and remain in the wilderness. Selah. Here he looks at the possibility of being away from other humans, right? Does that ever sound like sometimes it sounds like a good idea. Right? There's times, right? But David, he's thinking of if I could, I'd just be fine going and living in the wilderness. I can't handle this anymore. The false promise of fleeing from his troubles was relief. And then he says, I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. And here what we see is the troubles that he's going through is he likens to a storm. How about that? I just looked at the two people that I was talking to earlier about that, and they were both looking away. That's all right. You guys are just fine. Just go back to sleep. So, anyway, I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. So here he says, following on that hypothetical, oh, that I had wings like a dove, the false promise of fleeing from his troubles was peace. All of it sounds good. But David knows he doesn't have wings like a dove. And if he did, it's really not what he needs. And so what he does then is he explains his complaint and the injustice. He explains it to the Lord. And it's not like the Lord needs to know, but David needs to know that he has put the entire burden into the hands of God. And you'll see that is the point as we move along. But starting with verse 9 says, destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues. We're going to look at that separately in just a little bit. For I have seen violence and strife in the city. So we'll just pick up that second part because we're going to bring that first one back in a little bit. You'll see why. For I've seen violence and strife in the city. This is one of his complaints, is that the enemies, they're violent. And whether it is violence as a result of poor governance or violence as part of the governance is unclear. But it's violence and strife that David has seen. And this may just be Absalom's vindictive campaign against those remnants of David's administration. And certainly that was happening, right? Absalom was trying to root out the loyalties to his father within the administration. And so there was surely this is some of the violence that David is talking about that he is seeing in the streets, in the city. The next thing we see in verse 10 is not only are they violent, as we see in verse 9, but they also cause sorrow. You see in verse 10, day and night they go about it upon the walls thereof, the walls of the city that is. Mischief also and sorrow are in the midst of it. This is the result of this vindictive campaign that Absalom is going about. These are the schemes and the plans that were set in place to accomplish the coup of David's administration. There was all kinds of underhanded efforts that were going on, and from the time that Absalom was trying to gain the loyalty of the people while he was still supposedly serving his father, right? And there's a lot of grief and sorrow that's caused by the mischief that has gone on. That brings us to verse 11, in which we see David's complaint continues. He explains his complaint and the injustice. He says they were deceitful. See, verse 11 says, wickedness is in the midst thereof. Deceit and guile depart not from her streets. So lies and trickery is the currency of those who cannot advance by truth. It's not like Absalom could just have a press conference and say, okay, I just want everyone to know, I really just want to be king. David's great. He's actually as honest as all get out. He's a good man. But I really would like to rule. And so here I am. That wasn't going to work, right? So, so he tried to convince the people that that they needed him, right? And real injury is caused by these deceitfully advanced ambitions. You see verses 12 through 13 that one of these that David is talking about specifically, and I think the primary character of David's complaint is Ahithophel, right? I mean, Absalom is the force behind the violence and stuff, but the deceit comes from Ahithophel's tongue. David recognizes it, right? He recognizes the earthly wisdom of it, and he has some fear of that. David knows this, that some of the smartest things he ever did as a king, he did at the advice of Ahithophel, right? He's like, man, that guy is smart. He knows. And now he's filling Absalom's ear, and let's face it, he's smarter than I am. That's what David's thinking, you know. I mean, I just put that out there as my theory. But he puts this out there as something that is a great threat. So verses 12 through 13, we see that they used to be close friends. And he says, for it was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance. You can see here he goes from talking about Ahithophel in the third person to talking about him to him in the second person. Do you see that? And what that does is that raises the emotional level of the poetry. So this seems clearly to be a reference to Ahithophel. There's really no one else we can see in David's life and in this situation of David's reign that this would match. So this wound from a supposed friend felt unbearable to David. You see that those first two lines. For it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it. So what he's saying is, this is unbearable because this is a friend that has come against me. This is a friend that is advising my son on how to gain the loyalty of the people away from me and how to kill me. And he thought Ahithophel was his friend. Had it come from expected quarters, well, he could have anticipated it. That's where he says, neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. I'm sure David had an enemy list, right? I mean, a list of people who had set themselves as his enemies. And if he'd have seen one of those guys coming, he probably wouldn't have stopped and told him secrets. Ahithophel, on the other hand, oh, hey, come here, I got to tell you something, you know? And all the while, Ahithophel is working for Absalom. And it's the wounds inflicted by those closest, the deceit and the undermining by a counselor and a friend, that is most devastating. It was thou, a man mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance. That's some pretty high words for a king to speak of his advisor, former advisor. Verse 14, we see that they were fellow worshipers. That raises it another level, right? We took sweet counsel together and walked into the house of God in company. This seems like kind of, it's exasperation, but it seems an exasperation that would be breathless, as he's been punched in the stomach and doesn't have a lot of wind to say this with, right? He remembers walking to the temple with Ahithophel, having sweet counsel together on the way to the Lord's house. They had presumably been on the same page in just everything. They worshiped the same God. Supposedly, they had submitted to the same God. And the next thing we see is that they should be judged. The next verse is verse 15, but I held 19a, right, to drop it right here just because it also fits, they should be judged, right? So let's look at the first line of verse 9. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues. This is a prayer that David prayed, a prayer that God answered. You see, Ahithophel wasn't Absalom's only advisor. Ahithophel was definitely the wisest, I speak in terms of human wisdom, the wisest advisor, right? He was the one that bothered David the most, because how could he thwart the advice of Ahithophel? That was the guy that just guided me in all the wisest ways when I was a king. He was still the king. He got back on the throne eventually here, but when I was on the throne, and Ahithophel gave counsel to Absalom. But Absalom, as you might imagine, being who Absalom was, headstrong, proud, he had other counselors. He had Hushai, and he kind of liked Hushai's vibe. You can read between the lines. And Hushai and Ahithophel gave opposite counsel to Absalom. Absalom's not as wise as his father and didn't recognize the wisdom of Ahithophel and followed the advice of Hushai. Let's look at verse 15 now. So that prayer that he gave in verse 9, divide their tongues, opposing counsel. Ahithophel, verse 15, sorry. I've ordered these cards to lay down one at a time, and I'm trying to get them out of order. Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. So here David prays for the destruction of those who are working against him and against his administration and working under the advice of Ahithophel and executing the coup and the rebellion against David. So you know how they gave opposing advice, and Absalom went with Hushai. You know what Ahithophel did? Ahithophel, knowing that the steps that were advised by Hushai would bring Absalom's affairs to ruin, said, well, that's it then. I've burnt every bridge. I put all my eggs in this basket. And he's not going to listen to me. And he's going to listen to Hushai. And his administration is going to crash. And I'm going to be left out to hang. So I might as well hang myself. And that's what he did. I didn't mean that to come out quite that way, but he went and hanged himself. You can see it in 2 Samuel chapter 15 through chapter 17 to see that whole story. And it's that likeness that people try to say this is like Judas. Well, anyway. Now we turn to what is nearly without exception the direction that David takes in this kind of a situation, as he spent some time in discussion with God on a matter of great sorrow or discomfort. Here's the direction David typically takes. In verses 16 through 21, David exercised a determination to trust God. This is section 3. David exercises a determination to trust God. In verse 16, he trusts God to save him. As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. The this is absolute positive statements made one after another. All of the confidence that David has at this point is that I have put every aspect of my complaint and my worries and my sorrows and my suffering, and I've put it all at the feet of the Lord. And now it's all his. And he trusts God to save him. The Lord shall save me. Verse 17, we see that he trusts God to hear him. You remember when he was asking God to hear him? Now he's saying with absolute confidence, evening and morning and at noon will I pray, and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. God doesn't have any off hours, right? He's like, I'll call unto him any time of the day and any time of the night, and he will hear me. Verse 18, he trusts God to deliver him, and he trusts God to deliver those who are with him. He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me. There's two different ways, I guess you could see, there's two different ways you could see what David is saying here. One is, David might be saying that there are many who are on his side, that maybe God has brought to his side. It seems more likely to me that David is saying that there are many with me, and that's of great consequence to God. God cares about me, but he cares about all these who have been loyal and are following me and are trying to protect me. He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there are many with me. You see, he seems to put that as part of the consequence out there, that part of the reason why God is coming to his side. He says, this isn't just about me. It's about all these also who have done right, who have not followed Absalom, who are loyal to the king that God anointed. So you also notice he kind of changed the tense a little here. He said, the Lord shall save me, the Lord shall hear my voice, he hath delivered my soul. You see that? So he went from, this is going to happen, he will hear me, this is future, whenever I call upon him, I know he will answer. But let's just face it, he already wrote down how this all works, right? He's already delivered my soul. No matter how this turns out, I'm in his hands. So he states this as a done deal, as a concluded matter. Then he goes back to future again in confidence and in hope. He trusts God to deal with the wicked in verses 19 through 21. God shall hear and afflict them, even he that abideth of old. That is God, right? God shall hear and afflict them. He is going to hear me, and he's going to afflict my enemy, because he's been around a lot longer than they have, right? And I think that bears some weight, especially because he has so much respect for Ahithophel's advice. He says, but God's been around a lot longer than Ahithophel. Even he that abideth of old, Selah. It's a step up in the tempo. Because they have no changes, therefore they fear not God. That's kind of interesting, right? Because they have no changes, therefore they fear not God. You know why a lot of people don't fear God? Because they haven't been fearing him for a while, and it doesn't seem like there's been anything changed. So that seemed to work for a while. Probably going to work forever. Boy, that's really not looking long term. And they think there's not been any changes, so there won't be any changes. Therefore, they fear not God. He hath put forth his hands against such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. To be clear, this third person statement is of the wicked that don't fear God. Okay, it's not of God. This isn't talking about God. God didn't put his hands against such as be at peace with him. And God didn't break his covenant. This is the wicked. This is the ones that thought they could get away with attacking David, who had been at peace with them, right? David was at peace with Absalom. David was at peace with Ahithophel. They put their hands against such as be at peace with him, and he hath broken his covenant. Surely Ahithophel had made a covenant with David, right? And the words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. Well, that's just some good word choice, right? His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords. We see here the reasons then for David's confidence in the judgment of the wicked. And number one is they didn't fear God. And the wicked think that because they have not seen judgment yet, that it isn't coming. Number two, they broke their commitments. He hath broken his covenant. David had no animosity or reason to Ahithophel. I typed David, but Ahithophel had no animosity or reason to turn against David except maybe personal ambition, right? They were also deceptive with flattery. You see that in verse 21. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords. David likely speaks of Ahithophel here, thinking of how smooth he had been to convince David of his undying loyalty. Next, we see the maskil, the instruction. Verse 22, David exhorts us to trust the Lord. He says, cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. He gives this psalm in a voice to the Lord, reporting his situation, praying to the Lord, speaking of his confidence in the Lord. And then he turns to the people and he says, hey, take my word for it. If you have a burden, you can give it to him. That's the maskil. That's the instruction. That's where he makes the application. And I can't think of anyone more qualified to give that advice, right? David was going through just unspeakable suffering with these two great burdens he was carrying. And he comes to this conclusion. You have a burden. Give God your burden, and he will sustain thee. It's a burden too heavy for you to bear. So give it to him, and he will support and he'll nourish you. That's what it means to be sustained. And then he says, he shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. Live righteous, and he will give you stability. You want stability? Live righteously. I should have said righteously. That's better. Just put an ly right next to the righteous. If you want stability in your life, there are no shortcuts. Righteousness is the way to stability. And if you think, well, I totally agree with that. I just got this one thing, and I'm going to just skirt this one corner. Nope. You are giving up stability in your life. Live in a way that shows you believe that God blesses the righteous. Verse 23. This is kind of in conclusion. But thou, O God, shalt bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in thee. If you see this as kind of theatrically speaking, which I think sometimes that's how David's psalms are meant to be, in which perhaps he's even performing the psalm in front of the people, right? He turns to the people, he gives the maskil, and then he turns to God, and he says, but thou, God, shalt bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in thee. David concludes with the observation that it never pays to attack God's children. God will always stand up for those who trust him. So let's rest in his care, even when we are hurt by those closest to us. And that's it. That is Psalm 55.